He didn't call them that night. Well, he had bingo to go to, and anyway, he didn't have a phone at home. Given his record, 2 convictions and jail time for indecent assault and sexual assault, he didn't want to get involved. But 24 hours later, on Friday afternoon, Wilson decided he'd better report what he had found. Just before 5 o'clock in the afternoon on February 24th, 1995, he drove east into Mission, the nearest town with a police station. As soon as he saw a police car, he stopped it. The police officer called the Mission RCMP station on Oliver Street, and almost right away the control officer called Constable Chris Annaly, on duty in his cruiser, and asked him to meet Wilson, who would be waiting for him at the Stave River lay-by. Wilson, the dispatcher explained, would point out some human remains he'd found the day before. Annaly knew the location well. The Lougheed Highway, the old number 7, once the main road between Vancouver and Hope, stitches together most of the small working-class towns along the north banks of the Fraser River. Running east from Vancouver, the Lougheed stretches through Burnaby, Coquitlam, and Port Coquitlam, the Tri-Cities area as it's called, to Maple Ridge, Mission, and Agassiz, before it reaches Hope. Most drivers choose the much faster Trans-Canada, the superhighway that runs along the south side of the Fraser, but the Lougheed is what you take if you're a local. And this small stretch of the Lougheed, where Bill Wilson was waiting for Chris Annaly, is one of the prettiest parts of the highway. Now in early spring, leaves were just beginning to come out on the trees, and the riverbanks were greening up. Silvermere Lake is a popular resort area near the Stave River, where many people have built new ranch-style houses back from the shoreline. Their lawns are green and well-tended. A small Indian reserve is wedged into the few acres between the lake and the Stave River. Across the highway is the Fraser River. In fact, the highway where Wilson was waiting is really just a bridge, not more than 500 feet long and banked on each side by deep sloughs crammed with elders and dense brush. The south side, beside the Fraser, crowded here with log booms, is where the main Via Rail track runs on its way east toward Toronto, perhaps a couple of 100 feet from the road. Local fishermen, most from the Stave River Band, often make their way down the bank on the side to cast their lines into the river for salmon. When Annaly pulled his cruiser into the lay-by, he spotted Wilson waiting for him. Wilson led the policeman down the steep bank to an area about halfway between the highway and the train track. 3 large rocks left over from the highway construction bumped up through the reeds and bracken. Water still pooled in the low spots, but Annaly could see the small dark object on the ground in front of the rocks. No question, he thought. Wilson's right. It's a human skull. Annaly hurried back to his car and grabbed his radio. "We need a camera here right now," he told Corporal Brad Zallis, the officer in charge of the detachment. The men didn't have long to wait. Zallis was there by 5:35 p.m., when there was still enough light left to get a few decent pictures of the skull on the ground. In fact, it was just half a skull, split in half vertically, cleanly, from the crown down through the back of the head and the jawbone in front. A small scrap of the first vertebra was attached to the neck, but there was no sign of the other half of the head. What they were almost certain of, however, was that this skull had not been there a long time. Scraps of white flesh clung to the areas around the eye socket, and the nose was still attached. For a minute, the officers talked about whether or not the area was a crime scene, but on the whole they thought not. Annaly and Zallis thought it had been from a native gravesite. "We thought maybe it had floated down, because a few days earlier that slough had been flooded right up to the road, and it obviously hadn't been there before," Annaly said later. "An Indian burial that had been uncovered somewhere and just floated down." Still, that cut through the crown was odd. The officers decided there was no need to seal off the area with yellow crime scene tape. Zallis placed the skull in a box and drove it back to Mission. Annaly followed in his car, entered the skull in the exhibits record with the number 95-2409, and, because it was still damp, put it in a cardboard box and placed it on a shelf to dry. 2 days later, the file and the skull went to Corporal Tim Slay, a young detective in the RCMP's investigative section.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.